Under sodium lights, a plow driver noticed an unmoving shape beside a drifted guardrail, breath fogging the windshield as snow whispered across frozen asphalt. Patrol tape fluttered, boots crunched, and a camera clicked. Nothing screamed violence, yet everything felt wrong, clinical, unfinished, waiting for winter dawn to expose methodical evidence. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The location sat just outside Warwick, Rhode Island, where Route 117 bends past low marshland and warehouse backs, a place drivers remembered for frost and crosswinds rather than tragedy. The calendar read January 3, 1991, the quiet stretch between New Year's and the return of routine. Snowbanks hardened like concrete. Holiday wreaths still clung to lampposts. The woman found there was later identified as Emily Harper, 22 years old, a college senior home for winter break, reported missing after Thanksgiving, but lost in the seasonal noise of travel and weather. The discovery set a tone familiar to older investigators and to men who remembered winters when engines stalled and phones stayed tethered to walls. It was a case that demanded patience, paperwork, and restraint. Emily Harper's body lay positioned with an orderliness that unsettled first responders. No obvious trauma declared itself. Clothing was intact, winter-appropriate, and consistent with someone who had planned to be outdoors briefly. The absence of chaos suggested a timeline that would have to be reconstructed from small details. The cold preserved some answers and erased others. A preliminary examination at the scene noted lividity patterns consistent with exposure, not displacement, and the lack of footprints around the guardrail hinted at snowfall after the event. Officers documented tire marks half buried by plow spray, measured distances to the nearest exit, and photographed the reflective tape on the rail, all while breath steamed and fingers stiffened. The autopsy conducted at the Rhode Island State Medical Examiner's office reflected the era's careful conservatism. Cause of death was listed as hypothermia with contributing factors pending investigation. There were no defensive injuries, no fractures, no signs of a struggle. Toxicology would later reveal alcohol at a modest level, consistent with holiday gatherings, and trace amounts of a prescribed sedative not listed in her medical records. That anomaly would sit unanswered for years. Time of death was estimated between late evening on December 27 and early morning December 28, during a snow event that complicated travel and memory alike. Emily's background appeared ordinary in ways that sometimes conceal complexity. She grew up in Cranston, attended the University of Rhode Island, and worked part-time at a bookstore. Friends described her as cautious, organized, and independent. She drove a blue 1986 Honda Civic, which was found 2 days after her disappearance in a supermarket lot near Bald Hill Road, legally parked, keys missing, no damage, and no signs of forced entry. Receipts in the glove compartment marked Thanksgiving groceries and a tank of gas purchased December 26. Phone records showed a call placed from a payphone near the lot at 9:14 p.m., destination unknown. The investigation unfolded in the measured cadence of the early 90s. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods with clipboards and boots, not apps. They pulled credit card statements by fax and waited days. Witness interviews filled spiral notebooks. A gas station clerk remembered a young woman asking for directions in the snow, though the memory wavered under follow-up. A plow operator recalled a stalled car on the shoulder that night but could not place it precisely. Weather reports were consulted to align snowfall with plowing schedules. The case file grew thick with timelines that overlapped imperfectly, leaving gaps where winter swallowed sound. Media coverage followed a restrained local tone. The Providence Journal ran a brief front-page item, then moved the story inside as weeks passed. Missing person flyers curled on corkboards, edges browned by radiator heat. For men who read the paper with coffee and remembered their own daughters at that age, the case struck a chord without theatrics. Police held to facts, emphasizing that there was no immediate evidence of foul play while acknowledging unanswered questions. That balance kept panic low and frustration high. In February 1991, investigators focused on the sedative. Pharmacy logs were reviewed, prescribers contacted, and samples retained. The compound, common enough, pointed to access rather than malice, but it suggested that Emily may have been impaired. That line of inquiry intersected with a man she had dated briefly in the fall, a 28-year-old warehouse supervisor named Thomas Reed. Reed owned a pickup truck equipped with a plow mount, had a prescription for the sedative following a back injury, and lived near the route where Emily was found. He cooperated, provided statements, and allowed a cursory inspection of his vehicle. No forensic link emerged. In an era before routine DNA collection, suspicion rested lightly and drifted. The case cooled through spring. Snow melted, revealing nothing new. Emily's parents pursued records and pressed politely for updates. Detectives rotated assignments. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and shelved in a climate-controlled room that smelled of paper and dust. The file remained active on paper and dormant in practice. Years passed. Rhode Island changed in small ways. Roads were widened. Payphones disappeared. Men who once worked cases retired and carried memories home. What revived the investigation decades later was not a confession or a tip, but a policy. In 2018, the state initiated a cold case review emphasizing unexplained deaths with preserved biological samples. Emily Harper's file qualified. The sedative anomaly, the vehicle gap, and the exposure ruling invited reconsideration under modern standards. Samples retained from the autopsy, including blood and fibers, were re-examined. Advances allowed analysts to detect low-level transfer that once fell below thresholds. A fiber analysis revealed synthetic strands consistent with upholstery used in late 80s pickup trucks, blue-gray, weather-resistant, and uncommon in passenger cars. Paint transfer on a button matched a manufacturer batch used in plow assemblies sold regionally. The findings were not conclusive alone, but they narrowed the field. Records showed that Thomas Reed's employer had serviced his truck in December 1990, replacing interior panels after a tear. Service logs placed the truck in use during the snow event. Investigators rebuilt the timeline with phone metadata recovered from archived billing microfilm. The payphone call near the supermarket lot traced to Reed's residence. The duration suggested a brief exchange. Reed had earlier denied contact that evening. When re-interviewed, now in his late 50s, he corrected himself, citing poor memory. A search warrant authorized collection of DNA, which was compared to trace skin cells recovered from Emily's sleeve. The match was statistically significant. The case moved carefully through legal channels. Prosecutors charged Reed with manslaughter based on impaired endangerment, arguing that he administered a sedative without prescription, transported Emily while impaired, and left her exposed after a vehicle stop during a snowstorm. Defense filings challenged causation and timing. Expert testimony addressed hypothermia, sedation, and the reasonable foreseeability of harm. In 2021, after a bench trial suited to the case's age and complexity, Reed was found guilty. Sentencing reflected restraint. Reed received a term consistent with guidelines and credit for time elapsed, followed by supervised release. The courtroom was quiet. Emily Harper's name was spoken plainly. Outside, winter returned in a familiar way, snow lining the streets without ceremony. The archives closed another folder, not with triumph, but with a measured acknowledgement that patience, paper, and time had finally aligned. As winter loosened its grip in early 1991, the Emily Harper investigation settled into a quieter phase marked by paperwork rather than patrol lights. Detectives compiled their notes into a master chronology that tracked her movements from Thanksgiving through the final week of December. Credit card activity ended on December 26. Her employer confirmed a shift swap the following evening. Friends recalled holiday plans disrupted by snow warnings and early darkness. Each detail was placed carefully, creating a ledger of ordinary actions that ended without explanation. For men accustomed to balance sheets and maintenance logs, the case read like an incomplete ledger with missing entries that refused to reconcile. The Honda Civic became a focal point. Its discovery in the supermarket lot suggested intentional placement rather than abandonment. Snow accumulation on the roof aligned with the storm timeline, while the absence of fresh tracks nearby indicated it had been parked before the heaviest snowfall. Investigators dusted for prints with limited success. The steering wheel yielded partials that could not be confidently matched. Fibers collected from the driver's seat were cataloged, but provided no immediate lead. The keys, never recovered, suggested transfer to another person or loss in conditions that would never return them. Attention turned outward to roads and routines. Route 117 was not a place people lingered. It served warehouses and cut across marshland where winds sharpened cold. Patrol logs showed routine passes that night, none reporting a stranded motorist. Plow schedules confirmed staggered routes, leaving windows when a stopped vehicle could go unnoticed. Investigators mapped sightlines and distances, calculating how far someone could walk before exposure became dangerous. The analysis remained clinical, respectful of the reality that hypothermia can be silent and swift without spectacle. Witness statements were revisited and ranked by reliability. The gas station clerk's recollection was weighed against transaction times and weather reports. The plow operator's memory was compared to route maps. A college friend's account of a canceled gathering added context but no direction. Each interview was summarized, signed, and filed. The process reflected an older policing ethic that favored accumulation over intuition. Nothing dramatic emerged, and that absence itself became part of the record. By summer, investigators faced a decision familiar to cold climates and colder cases. With no probable cause and no fresh evidence, the case would remain open but inactive. Supervisors approved the transfer to archives, where boxes were sealed with inventory lists and placed on steel shelving. Emily Harper's name joined others, indexed and retrievable but unlikely to move without a catalyst. Her parents were informed with care. The language emphasized continued commitment while acknowledging limits. For men who had lived through similar conversations, the restraint carried its own weight. Years passed in measured increments. The town changed storefronts and resurfaced roads. The courthouse modernized its record systems, converting paper to microfilm and then to digital scans. Detectives retired, and new ones learned procedures from manuals rather than mentors. Emily's case resurfaced occasionally during training, cited as an example of unresolved exposure deaths and the importance of evidence preservation. The sedative notation remained circled in red ink on a photocopy, a reminder that anomalies endure. In 2005, a routine audit confirmed that biological samples had been retained according to policy. The notation prompted a brief review that reaffirmed earlier conclusions. Technology at the time still lacked the sensitivity to extract more from what remained. The file returned to its place. Media interest flickered during anniversaries, often tied to winter safety features rather than investigative breakthroughs. The tone stayed respectful, avoiding speculation. The community absorbed the story into its collective memory as a caution without an answer. The catalyst arrived in the late 2010s through institutional change rather than chance. A statewide initiative mandated a review of cold cases involving young adults and ambiguous causes of death. The criteria emphasized preserved evidence and potential for modern analysis. Emily Harper's case met both. A small team assembled, combining a veteran detective with analysts trained in contemporary forensics. They approached the file as a problem set, beginning with a clean timeline reconstructed from original documents. The sedative again took center stage, now examined with advanced toxicology. Analysts determined dosage ranges and onset effects, concluding impairment would have occurred within an hour of ingestion. This finding reframed the evening's possibilities, suggesting assistance or supervision during travel. Fiber analysts revisited samples with improved microscopy, identifying synthetic blends more precisely. The upholstery fibers, once generic, now matched a narrow production window used by specific manufacturers supplying utility vehicles. The team expanded the vehicle analysis beyond the Civic. Paint flakes from Emily's clothing, previously inconclusive, were compared against updated databases. A match emerged to a batch associated with plow mounts sold in New England in the late 1980s. Service records from regional garages were requested. The process was slow, involving archived invoices and handwritten logs. One entry stood out, documenting interior repairs to a pickup truck owned by Thomas Reed in December 1990. Reed's earlier involvement resurfaced not as a suspicion resurrected, but as a data point aligned. His proximity to the route, access to the sedative, and now the vehicle match formed a pattern that warranted renewed attention. Investigators requested a voluntary interview, mindful of elapsed time and rights. Reed provided updated biographical information and acknowledged limited contact with Emily during the holiday season. His account of December 27 differed subtly from his 1991 statement, particularly regarding phone use and travel. Phone metadata recovery required ingenuity. Billing records preserved on microfilm were digitized and analyzed. The payphone call near the supermarket lot traced to a number registered to Reed during that period. The call length suggested coordination rather than error. Investigators corroborated the finding with employment records showing Reed's shift ended early due to weather, placing him free during the relevant window. Each element was documented with citations, building a lawful foundation. Forensic DNA analysis became the final hinge. Advances allowed extraction from low-level skin cells preserved on Emily's sleeve. A comparison to Reed's sample yielded a strong statistical association. The finding did not claim violence but confirmed contact consistent with transportation. Investigators consulted medical experts to align the contact with the sedative timeline and exposure conditions. The conclusion formed a coherent narrative without sensationalism. Impaired transport, a stop along a cold route, and a failure to ensure safety. Prosecutors reviewed the assembled evidence with caution. The charge reflected causation grounded in neglect rather than intent. The legal theory emphasized foreseeability and duty of care under impaired circumstances. Defense challenges were anticipated and addressed through expert reports and chain-of-custody documentation. The case moved forward not as a spectacle, but as an exercise in methodical justice shaped by time, weather, and persistence. The decision to reopen the Emily Harper case carried a quiet weight inside the Warwick Police Department. It was not treated as a second chance at notoriety, but as an obligation finally matched with capability. The lead detective assigned to the review understood the expectations of restraint. Every assertion would need documentation. Every inference would need support. The goal was not to rewrite history, but to clarify it. The team worked from scanned originals, verifying dates, signatures, and evidence seals before drawing conclusions. Attention returned to the winter calendar of 1990 with an emphasis on human behavior during holidays. Thanksgiving had scattered families across highways and kitchens, while Christmas compressed schedules and amplified fatigue. Emily Harper's final weeks reflected that rhythm. She returned home earlier than planned due to exams, took extra bookstore shifts, and adjusted social plans around storms. Phone logs showed brief calls rather than long conversations. She did not signal distress. The absence of warning became part of the analysis, suggesting a sudden change rather than a prolonged crisis. Investigators reconstructed December 27 hour by hour. Weather reports documented a fast-moving system that dropped snow after dusk. Traffic cameras were rare then, but municipal logs noted plow deployment times. Reed's truck was equipped for plowing, and his employer confirmed he had volunteered for an evening run that was later canceled. That cancellation aligned with the early end of his shift. The gap between the end of work and the payphone call narrowed the window of opportunity with uncomfortable precision. The payphone itself had long since been removed, but records preserved its location and service history. Investigators visited the site, noting distances to parking areas and sightlines that would have existed before later development. The call duration suggested coordination rather than confusion. When paired with Reed's access to the sedative, the scenario gained plausibility without resorting to conjecture. The analysis emphasized what could be known, not what could be imagined. The sedative findings were revisited with modern pharmacology. Experts outlined onset, impairment levels, and interaction with cold exposure. The dosage inferred from blood levels would not incapacitate immediately but would dull judgment and reaction. That nuance mattered. It supported a theory in which Emily accepted assistance, traveled briefly, and then found herself exposed at a roadside stop. The absence of defensive injuries aligned with this account, reinforcing a narrative grounded in physiology rather than drama. Vehicle evidence received similar scrutiny. Upholstery fibers were matched to Reed's truck interior materials available during the late 1980s. The repair logs confirmed replacement panels installed weeks before Emily's disappearance. Paint transfer analysis placed flakes from a plow mount assembly consistent with Reed's equipment. Each finding was modest alone. Together, they formed a lattice that supported contact and proximity. The team avoided overstating certainty, framing results within accepted forensic standards. Reed's re-interview was documented with care. He appeared cooperative but inconsistent. Dates blurred, sequences shifted, and explanations softened. Investigators noted discrepancies without editorializing. They compared statements across decades, highlighting changes rather than accusing. When presented with phone records, Reed acknowledged the call but characterized it as incidental. The explanation did not reconcile with duration or timing. The record reflected that tension without commentary. Prosecutors weighed the evidence against statutory requirements. The decision to pursue a charge reflected an assessment that the facts met the threshold for criminal negligence resulting in death. The theory did not allege violence. It alleged failure. That distinction shaped filings and expert lists. Medical testimony focused on foreseeability. Transportation experts addressed roadside safety. Forensic analysts explained transfer evidence in plain terms. The case advanced deliberately, aware that age magnifies scrutiny. Pretrial motions addressed chain of custody and admissibility. The court reviewed preservation logs and expert methodologies. Rulings favored inclusion, not in compliance with standards in effect at the time of collection and improvements in analysis since. The bench trial format reduced theatrics and centered the record. Observers noted the absence of spectacle. Proceedings moved with a steady cadence familiar to those who valued order over display. During trial, the timeline was presented as a sequence of documented events. Emily Harper's movements, Reed's schedule, weather conditions, and forensic findings were aligned. Experts explained how hypothermia can progress quietly, how sedation alters perception, and how exposure at a roadside can be fatal within minutes under specific conditions. The court weighed whether a reasonable person would have recognized the risk. The analysis returned repeatedly to duty of care. The defense argued uncertainty, emphasizing gaps inherent in old cases. The prosecution responded with corroboration, showing how independent lines converged. The court considered credibility, consistency, and the absence of alternative explanations supported by evidence. In its findings, the court articulated the reasoning step by step, citing exhibits and testimony. The conclusion rested on neglect rather than malice, accountability rather than blame. The verdict arrived without flourish. Thomas Reed was found guilty of manslaughter under a theory of criminal negligence. Sentencing followed statutory guidance, tempered by time elapsed and lack of prior convictions. The court imposed a custodial sentence with credit, followed by supervision. The language acknowledged harm without inflaming it. Emily Harper's name was entered into the judgment, fixed within the record after decades of ambiguity. Afterward, the community responded quietly. There were no marches or cameras. Local papers ran measured stories, focusing on process and closure. Emily's parents issued a brief statement expressing gratitude for persistence and respect for the outcome. The department closed the file with a final review, updating databases and returning exhibits to storage or disposal as appropriate. Winter returned to Rhode Island in familiar fashion, snow along curbs and salt on boots, while a long unfinished ledger finally balanced. The sentencing phase closed the legal chapter, but opened a quieter accounting that unfolded beyond the courthouse. Records clerks finalized entries, sealing decades of paper into a coherent digital file. Evidence custodians updated logs, noting which items would be retained for appeal periods and which could be lawfully destroyed. The process reflected an ethic older than technology, one that prized completeness and traceability. For those who had spent careers inside municipal buildings, the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of manila folders marked a familiar ending. Emily Harper's case now carried a designation that had eluded it since 1991. Solved did not imply satisfaction. It implied resolution within the bounds of proof. Investigators who had retired were notified as a courtesy. Some responded with brief acknowledgments. Others offered clarifying notes that were appended to the file. The department archived a final summary that outlined how modern analysis intersected with preserved evidence. It was written plainly, intended for future auditors rather than audiences. The aftermath within the community unfolded without ceremony. Warwick residents continued routines shaped by seasons and schedules. The roads where events had occurred were repaved and widened. The guardrail was replaced after a routine inspection, its reflective tape brighter than before. There was no marker. The absence felt appropriate to those who valued order over memorialization in public infrastructure. Private remembrance took quieter forms. Emily's family addressed practical matters that had been deferred for years. Legal documents were updated. A scholarship fund established in her name received renewed contributions after local coverage. The fund's criteria emphasized winter safety and public service, reflecting lessons drawn without rhetoric. The family declined interviews, preferring statements that thanked investigators and acknowledged the court's findings. Their restraint mirrored the tone that had carried the case to its conclusion. For men who had followed the story in newspapers over coffee, the resolution reinforced a familiar truth about time and work. Cases do not age evenly. Some yield quickly. Others wait for tools and patience to align. The Emily Harper investigation became a reference point in training sessions, cited for evidence preservation and the value of revisiting anomalies. It underscored how small notes, circled decades earlier, can guide later inquiry. The legal outcome prompted procedural reviews statewide. Agencies assessed storage conditions and cataloging practices, ensuring that biological samples and trace evidence remained viable. Funding was allocated to digitize older logs and service records. The changes were incremental and unglamorous, but they reflected an understanding that tomorrow's answers depend on yesterday's discipline. The initiative avoided slogans, focusing instead on metrics and compliance. Thomas Reed entered the correctional system quietly. Intake records noted age, health, and risk assessment. The sentence allowed for supervision following release, with conditions tailored to accountability rather than spectacle. The system treated the case as it treats many others, with standardized processes and limited commentary. Appeals were considered and denied based on the record. The file closed again, this time with finality. Winter returned as it always had, shaping behavior in subtle ways. Snowplows moved on schedules refined by decades of experience. Salt trucks followed. Drivers adjusted routes. The season framed the story's beginning and end, not as a device, but as a context that influences human judgment. Hypothermia remains a hazard that announces itself quietly. Sedatives remain medications that demand care. The case reinforced these realities without moralizing. In the archives, Emily Harper's folder occupies a space among others resolved late. The label includes dates that span generations. The summary page outlines findings succinctly, referencing exhibits and rulings. It is written for readers who value clarity over narrative. The language avoids flourish, stating what was proven and how. It serves as a map for anyone who might one day ask how a case moved from uncertainty to closure. The town's local press returned to routine coverage. Crime briefs shared space with school budgets and road projects. The story receded from headlines, as resolved cases often do. Yet the knowledge lingered that persistence matters, even when progress is invisible. For an older audience accustomed to deferred maintenance and long-term plans, that lesson resonated. Emily Harper's name appears now in public records with context that had been missing. It sits within a legal finding that recognizes harm and responsibility. The record does not speculate beyond evidence. It does not amplify tragedy. It documents it. That documentation, careful and restrained, stands as the final product of years of methodical work. The case's quiet conclusion offers a form of closure aligned with the values of those who lived through earlier eras of policing and community life. It affirms that justice can be patient and precise, that winter does not erase accountability, and that even the most ordinary roads can hold answers if they are preserved long enough. The closing months after the verdict settled into a pattern that felt familiar to those who had watched the case mature slowly over decades. Administrative tasks replaced investigative urgency. Warrants expired, appeal windows closed, and files moved from active servers to long-term storage. The system did what it was designed to do when questions finally receive answers. There was no sense of celebration, only completion. In Rhode Island, where winter defines both landscape and temperament, that distinction mattered. Emily Harper's death no longer occupied a space of uncertainty in official language. Medical records were amended to reflect contributing circumstances established in court. The original hypothermia ruling remained accurate, but now it was contextualized by negligence and impairment. That precision mattered to archivists and to the quiet mechanics of justice. Accuracy, even delayed, carries weight for those who measure outcomes in documents rather than emotion. Law enforcement agencies across the region incorporated the case into continuing education, not as a cautionary tale filled with spectacle, but as a procedural example. Evidence retention, anomaly tracking, and respectful re-interviewing were emphasized. Younger officers learned that restraint in early conclusions preserves options later. Older officers recognized validation in the slow confidence of the approach. The case bridged generations through method rather than drama. Forensic labs documented the analytical advances applied during the review. Reports detailed how thresholds had changed, how low-level transfer evidence could now be interpreted responsibly, and how statistical significance should be communicated without overreach. The emphasis remained on limits as much as capabilities. The Harper case became a reference for how modern science can clarify, not exaggerate, historical facts. The community response remained understated. There were no memorial plaques along Route 117, no ceremonies by the Guardrail. The location returned to anonymity, serving trucks and commuters without acknowledgement of its past. This absence was not neglect but a reflection of local sensibility. Remembrance took place in quieter settings, among family and friends who preferred privacy to public ritual. Emily's parents continued their lives with a measure of closure that had once seemed unreachable. The scholarship fund stabilized, its mission refined. Each award cycle honored Emily's name through service and education rather than narrative. The family's statements remained brief, consistent, and free of accusation. Gratitude replaced uncertainty, and that shift carried its own gravity. Thomas Reed's legal status progressed according to schedule. Supervision conditions emphasized accountability and compliance. Reports were filed, reviewed, and archived. The system treated the case without distinction, applying standards evenly. There were no special provisions beyond those required by law. The quietness of that process reflected a principle older than any single case. Equal application sustains legitimacy. Winter continued to shape behavior across the state. Snowfall patterns varied year to year, but the routines remained. Plows ran before dawn. Salt trucks followed. Drivers adjusted speeds and expectations. The Harper case reinforced a practical lesson understood by those who had lived long enough to respect weather. Exposure does not announce itself loudly. Small decisions matter more in cold than in tension. In the courthouse, the case left a trace in training binders and digital repositories. Clerks referenced it when explaining record amendments. Judges cited it when discussing evidentiary standards in older cases. Its influence was technical rather than cultural, embedded in practice rather than memory. That embedding ensured durability. The final audit of the case confirmed compliance with policies at every stage. Where standards had evolved, documentation reflected adaptation rather than error. The audit concluded without recommendations, an outcome rare enough to merit notice among professionals. It signaled that persistence, when paired with discipline, yields reliable outcomes even across decades. Local press archived their coverage, updating headlines to reflect resolution. The language remained measured. There were no retrospectives filled with speculation, no attempts to dramatize what had already been carefully resolved. Readers absorbed the update and moved on. That response aligned with a readership accustomed to patience and proportion. Emily Harper's name now resides in records with context intact. It is linked to dates, findings, and conclusions supported by evidence. The record does not speak beyond its scope. It does not suggest motives it cannot prove. It stands as a complete account within lawful bounds. For those who value documentation, that completeness matters. The case's end reinforces a truth often understood best by older generations. Justice is not always swift, but it can be steady. It does not require noise to be effective. It requires preservation, review, and the willingness to return to questions without prejudice. The Harper case demonstrates that ethic in full. As another winter approaches, Rhode Island prepares as it always has. Equipment is serviced. Routes are reviewed. Communities adjust. Life continues within predictable rhythms. Beneath those rhythms lies the assurance that even long-frozen questions can thaw when conditions allow. The Emily Harper case reached its end not with spectacle, but with clarity, accountability, and a quiet return to order.